The machines beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. Jack stood at the edge of the hospital bed, holding the hand of a woman he had never spoken to, a woman who could not speak back. "You may now sign as her husband," the lawyer said, sliding a pen across the table. Jack's hand shook, not because of the money, not because of the mansion waiting outside, but because, just as the pen touched the paper, he felt something impossible. Her fingers moved, just slightly, just enough. Nobody else in the room seemed to notice. The nurse slipped away. The cousin standing by the door smiled like a man who had already won something. And Jack, a delivery driver who 3 days ago couldn't afford his mother's medicine, signed his name next to a woman everyone called gone. She wasn't gone. She was listening. She had been listening the entire time. And what she knew could destroy the very family paying for this wedding. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Hype up the video. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Let's get started. Jack Miller was 26 years old, and by the time most people were waking up, he had already delivered 12 packages across 3 neighborhoods of the city. His motorbike had a cracked mirror and a seat held together with tape, but it never once let him down, because Jack took care of it the way he took care of everything in his life. Carefully, and with more patience than the world gave him credit for. He lived with his mother Carol in a one-room house with a tin roof that turned every monsoon into a small war. The walls were thin enough that he could hear her cough at night, and lately, the coughing had gotten worse. 6 months ago, a doctor at the government clinic had used the word concerning. 2 months ago, another doctor had used the word serious. Jack had stopped asking what the next word would be, because he was afraid of the answer, and more afraid that he wouldn't be able to afford whatever came with it. He worked 16-hour days. He skipped meals so his mother could eat first. He had once walked 4 kilometers home in the rain because he'd given the last of his fare money to a street child who looked hungrier than him. His friends called him foolish for it. Jack just shrugged and said, "If I don't help, who will?" He wasn't chasing wealth. He had given up on that dream around the same time he gave up on finishing college, when his father died and the medical bills swallowed what little savings the family had. Since then, Jack's world had shrunk to a simple, exhausting loop. Wake up, work, come home, take care of his mother, sleep, repeat. He didn't complain. He didn't resent it. He simply endured it, the way people who love deeply often do, quietly, without asking for applause. It was a Tuesday evening when everything changed. Jack had just finished his last delivery when he saw a black car parked outside his house. The kind of car that didn't belong on his street, the kind that made neighbors peek through their windows and pretend they weren't watching. A man in an expensive suit stood beside it, holding a leather folder like it was something sacred. "Are you Jack Miller?" the man asked. "Who's asking?" "My name is Advocate Mark Sullivan. I represent the Kapoor family." He said the name the way people said things they expected to be recognized instantly. Jack had heard of the Kapoor family, of course. Everyone had. Whitfield Industries owned half the skyline in the business district, but he had never imagined a lawyer for that family would ever stand outside his broken gate. "I think you have the wrong house," Jack said. "I don't," Mark replied. "I have exactly the right one." He opened the folder and held out a document. Jack didn't understand half the legal language, but he understood the numbers. He understood them so clearly that his hands went cold. "This is a joke," Jack said. "It's not," Mark replied. "Mr. Richard Whitfield is dying. He has one condition left to fulfill before his empire transfers safely to his daughter. She needs to be married before her 25th birthday, or the entire company falls into the hands of a rival board faction. His daughter Emma Whitfield has been in a coma for 8 months. Jack stared at him. "You want me to marry a woman who's unconscious?" "I want you to save your mother's life," Mark said simply, glancing toward the house, where Carol stood in the doorway, listening. "This contract includes full medical coverage, immediate and lifetime." For a moment, Jack almost laughed. It sounded like something from a cheap television drama. A poor man, a rich comatose bride, a dying ballonier's wish. But when he looked at his mother's face, pale, thin, her eyes suddenly wet, the laughter died in his throat. "I need to think," Jack said. "You have 3 days," Mark replied. "After that, the offer expires, and so does her father's last chance to protect his daughter's inheritance." He got into the car and left Jack standing there, holding a piece of paper that could either save his mother's life or destroy everything he thought he understood about the world. Carol Miller had spent 18 years teaching her son one lesson above all others: never take more than what is honestly yours. It was strange then how quickly she pushed him toward a fortune that clearly wasn't. She had always been a private woman. She rarely spoke about her life before Jack's father, rarely mentioned her own family, rarely allowed anyone, even her son, to see the parts of her that still ached. She worked as a seamstress for as long as her hands allowed it, and when her health began to fail, she worked anyway, hiding the tremors, hiding the exhaustion, hiding the blood she sometimes coughed into a cloth she kept folded in her sari. She loved Jack with the fierce, silent love of a woman who had lost everything once before and refused to lose anything again. She never told him this, but she had made a promise to herself the day he was born: whatever storm comes, it will break on me first. He will never even feel the wind. When the lawyer's car pulled away that evening, Carol didn't ask her son what the offer had said. She already knew, not the details, but the shape of it. She had heard the name Kapoor through the window, and something in her chest had gone very still, the way the world goes still before an earthquake. "Amma," Jack said quietly, sitting beside her on the small cot. "They want me to marry someone I've never met. A woman in a coma. It doesn't feel right." Carol's hands trembled as she reached for his. "Take it," she said. Jack blinked. "Just like that? You don't even want to know more?" "I know enough," she said, though her eyes betrayed something else, something she was working very hard to keep buried. "Jack, listen to me. This is not about money. This is about your future, about being able to breathe without fear for once in your life." "What about you?" he asked. "Your treatment." "It's included in the contract," she said quickly. Too quickly. "You said so yourself." Jack studied his mother's face for a long moment. There was something underneath her urgency, something old and heavy, like a door she had shut a long time ago and was now being asked to stand in front of again. "Amma," he said slowly, "have you heard the name Kapoor before?" For half a second, so brief he almost missed it, her expression cracked. Then it smoothed over, practiced and calm. "Everyone has heard of the Kapoors," she said. "They're famous. That's all." It wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the truth either, and Jack, who had spent his whole life learning to read his mother's silences, knew the difference. He didn't push. Not yet. He told himself she was simply desperate for his future to be secure, that a dying woman's hope could make anyone act strangely. He told himself a lot of things that night, lying awake on the thin mattress, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't know for many weeks, was that his mother had once walked the halls of the very mansion he was about to enter, that she had once held an infant girl in her arms in that same garden, sung her to sleep beneath that same fountain, and been thrown out of that house branded a thief for a crime she never committed. Carol said yes too quickly that night, not because she wanted her son to be rich. She said yes because, for the first time in 18 years, there was a door back into the house that had taken everything from her, and she was terrified and hopeful and heartbroken all at once, that walking through it might finally set her name free. She said none of this to Jack. She simply held his hand and whispered, "Sign the papers, Beta. Some debts take a long time to come back around." Jack didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. Ryan Whitfield had the kind of smile that made people trust him instantly. Warm, easy, practiced like a well-worn suit. He was Richard Whitfield's nephew, the son of Richard's late sister, and for the past year, as Richard's health declined and Emma lay in her hospital bed, Ryan had quietly stepped into the role of acting CEO, a title the board had given him out of necessity, and one he had never once mentioned giving back. He met Jack for the first time on the day of the wedding rehearsal, striding across the marble lobby of Kapoor Towers with the confidence of a man who owned the building, though technically, he didn't caught. Jack, finally the man of the hour. Ryan clapped him on the shoulder like they were old friends. "Uncle Richard made the right call. You have an honest face. That matters more than people think." Jack, still overwhelmed by the size of the building, the number of guards, the sheer volume of wealth he was suddenly standing inside, only nodded. "I just want to do right by her," he said. "By Emma. Even if she can't, even if she doesn't know." Something flickered behind Ryan's eyes, so quick, so well hidden, that Jack would only recognize it in hindsight, weeks later, as the first small lie. "Of course," Ryan said smoothly. "We all just want what's best for her." Over the following days, Ryan was everywhere and nowhere, always cheerful, always helpful, always subtly steering. He was the one who arranged Jack's new clothes. He was the one who explained the household staff. He was the one who handled the allowance, depositing money into Jack's account personally instead of through the family trust, insisting it was just easier this way, less paperwork for everyone. It was Ryan who first mentioned the East Wing, in a tone so casual Jack almost missed the warning underneath it. "One thing, cousin," Ryan said, guiding Jack through the mansion's grand hallway. "The East Wing is off limits. Family privacy, Uncle Richard's old study, some private records, nothing exciting, just best left alone." "Understood," Jack said. He didn't think much of it, not at first. Rich families had rules poor people didn't understand. That's what he told himself. It was only later, when a housemaid was fired within the week for wandering near that same wing, that the rule began to feel less like privacy and more like a wall built around something Ryan didn't want anyone to see. Small things kept happening. A contract clause Jack wasn't shown until after he'd already signed the marriage papers. A comment Ryan made to a board member, half joking, half not, that Jack wouldn't be a problem much longer. When Jack asked him directly about it, Ryan laughed it off with practiced ease. "Wedding stress, cousin. Everyone's on edge. Don't take it personally." Jack wanted to believe him. He needed to believe him, because believing otherwise meant admitting he had walked his mother and himself into something far larger and far darker than a business arrangement. But there was a small, persistent voice inside him. The same voice that had once told him not to trust a delivery client who kept forgetting to pay. That whispered, "Watch this man carefully." He didn't know yet how right that voice would prove to be. The wedding took place in Emma's hospital room, dressed up with flowers and soft lighting to look less like a medical ward and more like a chapel. Cameras from 3 business news channels stood at a respectful distance, capturing the heartwarming story of a billionaire's dying wish. Jack stood at the bedside in a borrowed sherwani, holding the pale, still hand of a woman he had met for the first time only that morning. "You may say your vows," the priest instructed. Jack's voice cracked as he spoke words he barely understood the weight of. "I promise to protect you," he said quietly, meaning it more than anyone in that room could have guessed, "even if you never know it was me." That was when he felt it, the twitch, her fingers curling faintly around his. He froze. "Doctor," he said, "did you see that?" The doctor, a Kapoor family physician named Dr. Bennett, glanced at the monitors and offered a rehearsed smile. "Just a muscle spasm, Mr. Mehta. It happens in coma patients, nothing to be alarmed about." Jack looked to Sarah Collins, Emma's private nurse, standing near the machines. For a fraction of a second her eyes met his, sharp, alert, almost pleading, before she looked down and busied herself adjusting an IV line. It was such a small moment that anyone else would have missed it entirely. Jack didn't. After the ceremony, as guests exchanged polite congratulations over catered food in the hospital's private lounge, Jack found himself alone with Sarah Collins for the first time. "Is she really just unconscious?" he asked carefully. "Or is there more happening than you're telling me?" Sarah Collins's hands stilled over the tray she was arranging. For a moment, Jack thought she might actually answer honestly. Instead, her voice came out clipped, careful, like she was reading from a script someone else had written for her. "Mrs. Kapoor's condition is stable, sir. The doctors are monitoring her closely." "That's not what I asked. It's the only answer I'm permitted to give," Sarah Collins said, and this time there was something underneath the rehearsed calm. Fear. Jack recognized fear. He had grown up around people who spoke carefully because speaking freely had cost them before. That night, moving into the mansion for the first time, Jack lay awake in a bedroom bigger than his entire childhood home, and he thought about muscle spasms that curled fingers around a hand, and nurses who spoke like hostages, and cousins who joked about problems disappearing. 3 days later, he decided to read the file on Emma's accident, out of nothing more than restless curiosity. What he found didn't add up. The report described a single-car collision, moderate speed, driver-side impact. But the injuries listed, a skull fracture at the back of the head, bruising along both forearms consistent with someone gripping her arms tightly, didn't match a crash like that. They matched something else. Something Jack, who had delivered packages to enough hospitals and clinics to recognize the language of trauma reports, didn't want to say out loud yet. He closed the file and said nothing to anyone. But from that night on, Jack started watching the house differently. He started counting who came and went from the East Wing. He started noticing which staff members flinched when Ryan raised his voice, and which ones smiled at Ryan the way people smile at someone they're afraid of disappointing. Something in this house was wrong, and the woman he had married, a stranger he had promised to protect, might be the only one who knew exactly what it was. Section 6. Escalation. Number 1. The humiliation came slowly, the way water rises in a room before anyone notices they're already standing in it. It started with small things. At a dinner hosted for board members, Ryan introduced Jack as our newest asset, laughing as if it were a joke, while the table laughed along, and Jack sat there in a suit that didn't fit right, understanding for the first time that in this house, he wasn't a husband, he was a placeholder. Then came the allowance. Jack had assumed naively that the money supporting his mother's treatment came directly from the family trust, exactly as the contract promised. But when he asked the accounts department for a copy of the transfer records, simply out of habit, the same habit that made him check every delivery receipt twice, he was told politely but firmly that all such requests had to go through Mr. Ryan Whitfield personally. "Why would my own contract go through you?" Jack asked him directly. Ryan spread his hands, all warmth and reasonableness. "The trust is tied up in probate until Uncle Richard officially passes cousin. I'm covering things personally in the meantime. Out of my own pocket, frankly. You should be thanking me." It sounded plausible. It also sounded, to Jack's ear, exactly like the kind of story a man tells when he wants someone dependent on him rather than protected by paperwork. The public humiliation came next, sharper and more deliberate. At a company gala, Jack's first public appearance as Mr. Kapoor, a name the press had already started calling him despite his own objections, Ryan stood at the podium and told a story about Jack's background, framing his poverty as an inspiring rags-to-riches tale, while conveniently failing to mention that Jack hadn't asked for a single rupee of it. The room laughed politely at jokes about delivery boys becoming delivery of good fortune. Jack stood there, smiling because he had to, feeling something ugly and unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not embarrassment, anger. Later that night, walking the mansion's silent hallway back to his room, Jack passed the closed doors of the east wing and for the first time stopped. He tried the handle. Locked, as expected. But through the door, faint and almost imagined, he thought he heard something. A low mechanical hum, like the sound of hospital equipment. He knocked, softly. No answer. He told himself it was nothing. The next morning, Carol came to visit, her first time inside the mansion since the wedding. Jack walked her through the garden, proud despite everything to show her the fountain, the flowers, the life he now technically belonged to. But when they reached the old stone fountain at the center of the garden, his mother stopped walking entirely. Her face went pale. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Amma, what's wrong?" "Nothing," Carol said too quickly, already turning away, her breathing shallow. "It's nothing. I just felt dizzy for a moment." But Jack had seen her eyes in that instant. Not dizziness, but recognition. The specific bone-deep recognition of someone remembering a place they had once known intimately and never expected to see again. "You've been here before," he said. It wasn't a question. "Don't be silly," Carol said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How could I have been here before? Let's go inside. I'm tired." She wouldn't say another word about it, no matter how gently he asked. But that night, after she left, Jack sat alone in his room, turning the moment over in his mind, and a cold, uneasy feeling settled into his stomach. The feeling of a man realizing the story he'd been told about his own life had chapters missing. Section 7. Escalation. Number 2. The photograph fell out of an old shawl Jack's mother had packed for him weeks earlier, tucked between the folds like something forgotten, or something hidden. It was faded, the edges soft with age. A young woman, unmistakably his mother, though decades younger, stood in a garden holding an infant wrapped in white cloth. Behind her stood a stone fountain, the same fountain from the Kapoor mansion. Jack sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, just staring at it. His mother had told him, his entire life, that she had no connection to wealth, no history beyond their small village, no secrets worth mentioning. And yet here was proof, physical and undeniable, that she had once stood in that exact garden, holding a child that was not her own. He didn't confront her yet. Some instinct told him to gather more before he did. The same instinct that made him a careful, reliable delivery driver, the kind who checked an address twice before knocking on a stranger's door. That same week, the fired housemaid from the East Wing incident, a young woman named Grace Adams, became impossible to reach. Jack had gotten her number from another staff member, intending to ask a few quiet questions about what she'd seen. When he called, the number was disconnected. When he asked around, he learned her family had moved out of the city entirely. For a better opportunity, according to the head housekeeper, who delivered the line with the same rehearsed flatness Sarah Collins used whenever Jack asked about Emma's condition. People didn't just disappear like that, not without help, not without money changing hands to make sure they stayed quiet. Jack began keeping a private notebook, small, easy to hide, filled with dates, names, and small inconsistencies he didn't yet understand the shape of. The accident report that didn't match the injuries. The allowance routed through Ryan instead of the trust. The locked east wing. The vanished housemaid, his mother's reaction to the fountain. The photograph. Individually, each detail could be explained away. Together, they formed the outline of something deliberately, carefully hidden. The confrontation with Ryan came sooner than Jack expected, and far more directly than he was prepared for. He was summoned to Ryan's office on a Thursday afternoon, no explanation given. When he arrived, Ryan wasn't smiling. "I need you to sign these," Ryan said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "Trust transfer papers, standard procedure now that the marriage is legally finalized." Jack opened the folder and skimmed the first page, and his stomach dropped. Buried in dense legal language was a clause transferring control of Emma's shares, all of them, into a management trust with Ryan as sole executor. "This gives you full control of her company," Jack said slowly. "Not the trust. You." "It's temporary," Ryan said, his smile returning, thinner now. "Until Emma recovers. Which, medically speaking, cousin, maybe never." "I'm not signing this." Ryan's expression didn't change, but something in his voice sharpened. "Your mother's medical coverage is tied to this household's goodwill, Jack. I'd think carefully before making enemies of the people paying her bills." It was the first time the mask had cracked entirely, no joke to hide behind, no warmth to soften it. Just a clear, cold threat, delivered as casually as a weather report. Jack left the office without signing anything, his hands shaking with a fury he hadn't let himself feel until that moment. He understood now, with sudden and complete clarity, why he had really been brought into this house. He wasn't meant to protect Emma. He was meant to be a lever, a poor, grateful, easily controlled husband who would sign whatever was placed in front of him in exchange for his mother's life. And if he refused to be that lever, Ryan had made it very clear what the cost would be. That night, unable to sleep, Jack made his way to Richard Whitfield's old study in a part of the mansion Ryan rarely visited. Searching through old files, more out of desperation than any real plan, he found something that changed everything. A second will, unregistered, hidden beneath a false panel in the desk drawer. Dated only 4 months before Richard's stroke, the will gave Emma full, unconditional control of the company the moment she was legally married, completely bypassing Ryan and any trust he might try to construct. Richard Whitfield hadn't arranged this marriage to save his empire from a rival faction. He had arranged it to save his daughter from the nephew standing right beside her hospital bed. The narration shifts here. What follows is not Jack's story. It is Emma's, the story no one thought to ask her to tell, because no one believed she could hear them asking. Darkness does not always mean silence. For 8 months, Emma Whitfield had existed in a space with no name, aware of sound, of touch, of the slow passage of days, but unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but listen. Doctors called it a rare form of locked-in awareness following her head trauma. Her family called it a coma, and stopped asking further questions, because further questions were inconvenient. She had heard everything. The rehearsed lines Sarah Collins gave to visitors, the forced cheer in Ryan's voice when he stood beside her bed and told relatives how hopeful he remained, the particular careful silence that fell over the room whenever certain nurses changed her medication. A silence that, if she could have screamed, she would have screamed through. She had heard her own wedding, felt the stranger's hand holding hers, gentle in a way nothing in this house had been gentle in a long time, felt his voice crack as he promised to protect her, even though he had no idea what he was promising to protect her from. She had tried, with everything her broken body could summon, to move her fingers around his, and for one impossible second, she had succeeded. He noticed, she thought, from somewhere deep inside herself, in the only language she had left. He actually noticed, but it was the voice that came weeks later, soft and trembling in the garden outside her window, that broke something open in her memory she hadn't touched in years. That voice, I know that voice. It took her hours, an eternity in a mind with nothing but time, to place it. A lullaby half-hummed, from a childhood she had almost let herself forget. A woman's hands braiding her hair before school. A woman who had loved her the way only someone with nothing to gain could love a child. Carol Diddy, it's her, she's alive, she's here. Emma's memory, fractured and slow to return, began surfacing pieces she hadn't accessed since before the accident. She remembered being 6 years old, crying in a hallway while her aunt, Ryan's mother, screamed accusations at a nanny who had done nothing but love her. She remembered Carol being dragged out of the house by security, sobbing, protesting her innocence to no one who would listen, while the real thief, the aunt herself, skimming money from the household accounts for years, stood by and let an innocent woman take the blame. They destroyed her. They destroyed her life for something she never did. And now that same family had brought Carol's son into this house, using him the exact same way they had once used his mother, as someone poor enough, desperate enough, to be controlled. The accident came back to her next, in pieces sharp enough to cut. The argument in the car, Ryan's voice, no longer warm, demanding she sign over her decision-making authority before her father's condition worsened further. Her refusal, his hand, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. The swerve that wasn't an accident at all but a shove. His hand on the wheel, or perhaps on her, she couldn't be entirely certain, only that the last thing she remembered before darkness was not the impact of a crash, it was being pushed. He did this to me, and now he's doing it to Jack. Trapped inside a body that would not obey her, Emma began to fight in the only way left to her, pouring every ounce of will she had into the smallest movements. A finger, an eyelid, a breath held a half-second longer than her body wanted. She didn't know if anyone would ever notice. She didn't know if she had enough time before Ryan finished what he'd started, but there was one person in that house who had noticed already, who had been noticing, quietly for over a year. Sarah Collins was not cold. Sarah Collins was terrified and had been for a long time, ever since the night she'd overheard Ryan on the phone, instructing the pharmacy to adjust Emma's sedation levels, just enough to be safe, levels that had nothing to do with medical necessity and everything to do with keeping her silent for as long as possible. Since that night, Sarah Collins had been recording. Every visit, every conversation Ryan didn't know she could hear. Waiting, not for courage, because she had that already, but for the one moment when speaking up wouldn't simply get her disappeared like Grace Adams, but would actually be believed. Please, Emma thought, the closest thing to prayer she had left, let someone find what she's been collecting before it's too late. Jack didn't sleep that night. Sitting in his room with the unregistered will spread out on the bed in front of him like evidence at a trial only he had access to. He understood now what he was married into. Not a business arrangement, but a battlefield, with Emma as the prize Ryan needed under his control, and Jack as the collateral damage standing in the way. The next morning Ryan summoned him again, and this time there was no pretense of family warmth at all. "I heard you were in my uncle's study," Ryan said, standing by the window with his back to Jack, his voice deceptively calm. "Looking for something? Just getting to know the house," Jack said carefully. Ryan turned. His smile was gone entirely now, replaced by something colder and far more honest. "Let's stop pretending, Jack. You're a smart man. Smarter than I gave you credit for, so I'll be direct." He walked closer, each word deliberate. "Sign the transfer papers, today, or your mother's hospital account gets frozen by tomorrow morning, and we both know what stage her illness is at. Fast or slow, your choice." Jack's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "You pushed her in the car, didn't you?" For the briefest moment, so brief Jack almost doubted himself, something like fear crossed Ryan's face. Then it hardened into contempt. "Careful," Ryan said quietly. "Accusations like that, from a man with no money, no power, and a dying mother, tend not to go very far in this world. Sign the papers, Jack. Save what you can still save." "No," Jack said. The word surprised even him. It came out clear and final, the first time in his life he had refused something with money attached to it. The first time he had chosen a stranger he'd never spoken to over his own family's safety. Ryan's jaw tightened. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Jack said. "But I won't regret refusing to become the man you are." He walked out before Ryan could respond, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, terrified of what he had just risked, and terrified of what would happen if he hadn't. That evening, his phone rang. It was the hospital where his mother received treatment. His stomach dropped before the nurse even finished speaking. "Mr. Mehta, I'm sorry to inform you. Your mother's coverage was flagged for review this afternoon. We need updated payment confirmation before continuing her next treatment cycle." Ryan had moved fast, faster than Jack had expected, faster than felt survivable. He called his mother immediately, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, and found her strangely calm on the other end of the line. Calmer, in fact, than he had heard her in weeks. "Jack," Carol said, "it's time I told you everything. Carol arrived at the mansion the following morning, and this time she didn't stop at the garden gate. She walked straight through it, past the fountain, into the house that had once thrown her out with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and a false accusation stitched into her name. Before she could find the right room to say what she'd come to say, Jack pulled her aside into a quiet study and showed her his notebook. The accident report, the disconnected allowance, the vanished housemaid, and finally the photograph. Carol's hands trembled as she touched the faded image of her younger self. "I was her nanny," she said quietly. "Emma's, from the time she was born until she turned 6. I loved that girl like she was my own." Her voice cracked, and then one day money went missing from the household accounts. Ryan's mother, Emma's aunt, had been taking it for years, quietly, carefully. When the family finally noticed the shortfall, she needed someone to blame. "I was convenient, poor, easy to accuse, easy to believe guilty. They fired you," Jack said slowly, "for something you never did." "They did worse than fire me," Carol said. "They made sure every household in this city knew my name as a thief's name. No one would hire me after that. I nearly lost you too, Jack, those first years. I could barely feed us." She looked up at him, eyes wet but steady. "When that lawyer came to our door with the Kapoor name on his papers, I saw a chance I never thought I'd get again. Not for money, for the truth. I just didn't know how to tell you all of it, without dragging you into a war I started 18 years ago." "You didn't start it," Jack said firmly. "They did." While mother and son sat together, piecing together the past, someone else in the house had finally decided the time for silence was over. Sarah Collins found Jack alone that afternoon, near Emma's private room, her hands full of a small hard drive she'd kept hidden inside a medical supply box for over a year. "I have recordings," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder before continuing, "of Ryan, instructing the pharmacy, talking about keeping her sedated longer than she needs to be. I've been afraid to bring them forward, afraid of what he'd do. But I can't watch this happen to you the way it happened to Grace Adams." Jack took the drive with hands that felt suddenly too heavy for his arms. "Why now?" "Because yesterday," Sarah Collins said, her voice dropping even lower. "For just a second, I saw her fingers move, on their own. Not a spasm, a real deliberate movement." Her eyes filled with something between fear and hope. "I think she's trying to come back, Mr. Mehta, and I think Ryan is running out of time to stop her." That night, in the privacy of his room, Jack played the recordings. Ryan's voice, cold and businesslike, discussing sedation levels with a pharmacist who sounded uneasy, but compliant. A conversation months earlier with a board member, casually mentioning that Emma's condition gives us more flexibility with the transfer timeline. And finally, a recording Jack almost couldn't bring himself to finish. Ryan, alone talking to himself in a hospital hallway, muttering, "She never should have fought me on this. None of this would have happened if she'd just signed." It wasn't a full confession, but it was close enough, layered together with the medical proof of unnecessary sedation, the unregistered will, and 18 years of a stolen reputation, to form something Jack finally understood clearly. Not a family tragedy, a crime, carefully hidden behind wealth and warmth and well-tailored suits. The board meeting had been scheduled for weeks, the final vote on the trust transfer that would hand Ryan full control of Emma's shares. Jack and Sarah Collins arrived early, the hard drive copied twice over and secured with a company lawyer neither Ryan nor his allies knew Jack had quietly hired. Ryan stood at the head of the boardroom table, mid-presentation, all easy confidence and rehearsed charm, when Jack walked in with his mother beside him. "Cousin," Ryan said, forcing a smile. "This is a closed meeting." "Not anymore," Jack said. He nodded to the lawyer who connected a laptop to the boardroom screen without waiting for permission. Ryan's own voice filled the room seconds later, cold, calculating, discussing sedation timelines with a pharmacist as though adjusting a delivery schedule rather than a woman's consciousness. The color drained from Ryan's face in real time. "This is fabricated," he said quickly, too quickly, his voice rising. "Doctored. You can't prove." "The hospital pharmacy records match the recordings exactly," the lawyer said calmly, sliding printed documents across the table to each board member. "Independently verified this morning." Carol stepped forward then, her voice trembling but clear, cutting through the room's stunned silence. 18 years ago, I was accused of stealing from this family. I never took a single rupee. It was Ryan's mother, your own aunt," she said, looking directly at Ryan, "who took that money, year after year, and let an innocent woman take the blame so no one would look closer at her own accounts." She reached into her bag and produced an old, carefully preserved bank statement, proof she had kept for 18 years, waiting for a moment she'd almost stopped believing would ever come. I kept this because some part of me always knew the truth would matter again someday. The room erupted into murmurs, board members exchanging horrified glances, years of quiet trust in Ryan's judgment collapsing in real time. "You're all going to believe a delivery driver and a fired nanny over me?" Ryan snapped, his composure finally shattering completely. "We're going to believe evidence," one of the senior board members said quietly. "Something you never gave us a reason to need before today." It was in that moment, amid the shouting, the accusations, the room's collective horror finally breaking free, that a small sound cut through everything, a soft gasp from the doorway. Sarah Collins, who had rushed to check on Emma during the chaos, stood frozen, staring back into the boardroom, her face pale with disbelief. "Come," she said, barely able to get the word out. "Please, come now." They found Emma's fingers curled tightly around the bedsheet, her eyelids fluttering with visible, deliberate effort, her breathing quicker and shallower than it had been in 8 months. It wasn't a full awakening, not yet, but it was undeniable, visible proof, exactly at the moment it mattered most. "She's fighting to come back," Sarah Collins whispered, already documenting the vitals with shaking hands. "Right now. She's fighting." Ryan appeared in the doorway moments later, having followed the commotion, his face a battlefield of panic barely held together. "This changes nothing," he said, though his voice cracked on the words. "She's still not conscious. The board vote is suspended," the senior board member said flatly, arriving behind him, pending a full criminal investigation into medical endangerment and the circumstances of Ms. Kapoor's accident. Ryan's eyes darted around the room, to Jack, to Carol, to Sarah Collins, to the machines, showing his cousin's fight for consciousness in real time, and something in him seemed to finally understand. There was no smooth exit left. "I want her moved," he said suddenly, grasping at authority he no longer had. "To a private facility. For her safety. I'm still her legal guardian until—" "You are not," the lawyer interrupted, stepping forward with quiet finality. "The unregistered will your uncle left specifically revokes any guardianship the moment Ms. Kapoor's marriage was legally finalized. That happened weeks ago. You have had no legal authority over her medical decisions since the wedding, Mr. Kapoor. Every sedation order you influenced since then was outside your authority entirely." The words landed like a verdict. Ryan opened his mouth to argue and found, for the first time in the entire ordeal, nothing left to say. Jack stepped closer to him then, his voice low, steady, carrying none of the fear he'd walked into this house with weeks earlier. "You threatened my mother's life to control me," he said. "You destroyed her name 18 years ago to protect your own family's theft. You hurt Emma, your own cousin, because she refused to hand you power that was never yours to take." He held Ryan's gaze without flinching. "I came into this house with nothing, and you still couldn't make me sign." Security arrived minutes later, summoned quietly by the board's legal counsel, and escorted Ryan from the building, not in handcuffs yet, but under instructions not to leave the city while formal charges were prepared. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He simply walked out, with the stunned, hollow expression of a man watching every carefully constructed lie collapse in the space of a single afternoon. Behind him, in the hospital room, Emma's eyes opened fully for the first time in 8 months. The consequences that followed were not dramatic in the way villains in stories are usually punished. There was no lightning, no public scene of collapse. Justice arrived the way it usually does in real life, slow, procedural, and ultimately complete. Ryan Whitfield was formally charged with medical endangerment and assault, based on the sedation records, the pharmacy testimony, and, once Emma regained enough strength to speak with investigators, her own account of the night of the accident. The board, in an emergency session, voted unanimously to remove him from any position within the company, freezing his access to accounts he had spent over a year quietly consolidating control over. The story broke publicly within days, and the same news channels that had once covered Jack's wedding as a heartwarming fairy tale now covered Ryan's unraveling as a cautionary one. A story about greed dressed in good tailoring finally exposed. He didn't go to prison for decades, as movie villains often do. The legal process was long, complicated by his family's remaining resources and lawyers. But he lost everything that had mattered to him, the company he'd maneuvered for, the reputation he'd built, the family name he'd hidden behind. He became, almost overnight, a man other executives quietly warned each other about, a name no boardroom in the city wanted associated with their own. Carol's name, meanwhile, was formally and publicly cleared. The board issued a written statement, rare for a company of that size, acknowledging the wrongful accusation made against her 18 years earlier and the internal cover-up that had protected the real culprit. It wasn't the apology of a family owning up to a mistake so much as a company protecting its own image, but for Carol, the words on paper mattered less than what came after. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, people in her community looked at her without suspicion. Old acquaintances who had once crossed the street to avoid her began greeting her by name again. She didn't need their approval anymore, not really, but healing, she found, sometimes comes in small, ordinary gestures rather than grand ones. Her medical treatment, fully secured now under the terms of the original contract, verified independently this time, with no strings attached to any one person's goodwill, continued without interruption. The doctors, cautiously, began using words like manageable instead of concerning. Sarah Collins was offered a formal position as head of Emma's long-term recovery care, a role she accepted with visible relief, finally free of the fear that had shaped every careful word she'd spoken for over a year. "I kept those recordings so long," she admitted to Jack once. "I almost forgot what it felt like to not be afraid of my own voice." There was no cartoonish downfall for Ryan, no exaggerated punishment beyond what the truth itself demanded. He faced exactly what real consequences look like: criminal charges, professional ruin, social disgrace, and the quiet, permanent understanding among everyone who had once trusted him that trust, once broken this completely, does not simply grow back. Emma's recovery was slow, the way real recoveries usually are. Not the instant, dramatic awakening of movies, but weeks of physical therapy, of relearning how to hold a spoon, how to walk the length of a hallway without support, how to speak in full sentences after months of silence. Through all of it, 3 people stayed close to her bedside without ever being asked to: Sarah Collins, who had protected her for over a year before anyone else believed there was anything left inside her to protect; Carol, who visited every week, humming the same half-forgotten lullaby that had first broken through Emma's silence; and Jack, who had promised to protect a stranger, and had somehow, without either of them planning it, become someone she genuinely wanted in her life. "You didn't know who I was," Emma said to him one evening, her voice still soft from disuse, sitting up in bed with more strength than she'd had in months. "You didn't know about the will or the money or any of it. You just refused to let him win." "Why?" Jack considered the question honestly before answering. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "I didn't need to know who you were to know that." Emma studied him for a long moment, something gentle and unguarded settling into her expression, the look of someone recognizing, finally, that not every hand reaching toward her wanted something in return. "I want the marriage to stay real," she said quietly. "Not because you saved the company, not out of gratitude. Because you're the only person in this house who protected me without knowing what protecting me was worth." Jack didn't answer right away. He simply reached for her hand, the same hand that had twitched around his on their wedding day, the first small sign that she was still fighting, still there, still worth protecting even when the world had written her off as gone. Carol, watching from the doorway with tears she no longer bothered hiding, thought about the young woman she had once sung to sleep in a garden 18 years ago, and the son she had raised alone through every hardship since. She thought about how strange and quiet justice could be, not loud, not vengeful, just patient, arriving exactly when it was needed most. Outside the hospital window, the city moved on the way cities always do, indifferent to the quiet miracles happening inside its walls. But in that room, something had finally fully healed: a mother's stolen name, a stranger's unrewarded loyalty, and a family built, not on contracts or inheritance, but on the simple, stubborn decision of 2 ordinary people to do right by each other, long before either of them had any reason to expect it back. Some debts, Carol had once said, take a long time to come back around. This one finally had.
Moral of the story: kindness and bravery will always be more valuable than money, power, or status. Though impoverished, Jack never let money influence his principles. He decided to stand for truth and defend an innocent person, even if he was menaced and given a fortune. His generous acts demonstrated that real character is shown in difficult decisions, not simple ones. On the other side, Ryan's avarice and lust for authority drove him to betray his own family and carry out terrible atrocities. Though he appeared successful for a while, the reality finally surfaced, and he paid the price of his actions. The story also shows us that although justice might be postponed, it is never impossible. After many years, Carol's innocence was eventually proven, so demonstrating that faith and patience might provide healing. The narrative above all serves to remind us that true pleasure comes from honesty, empathy, and following what is correct, even when it is challenging. Good deeds and sincere motives always have a long-lasting effect, but lies and selfishness finally damage themselves.